All right, so I have sort of a horror story question situation for you, but it needs to be answered and really just planned for. So the question is, what would you do if the developer or the agency who's building your no-code app, what would you do if they just disappeared? Or on the flip side, what would you do if you were building your app and then you no longer could one day, or maybe you could no longer handle it one day and you needed to bring someone else on? How would you make sure that your app continues moving forward correctly and growing? That's what we're going to talk about today, because while it would really just be easier to ignore these kinds of questions, in reality, you can plan ahead for this type of stuff. And by planning ahead, you're not just spending extra time doing something for a just in case scenario, you're actually setting yourself up for long-term success. This is something we do with our own clients. And so I want to share it with you as well. Make sure you stick around until the end, because I also want to lead you into a deep dive free training from here so you can continue moving forward correctly with your no-code app. Now, first, if you're new around here, my name is Kristen, and I'm the co-founder of Coaching No Code Apps, where we help non-technical entrepreneurs build custom apps so they can either launch their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses all without coding. All right, so the first question is, if you're outsourcing the development of your no-code app, what do you do if your developer just disappears one day? Now, sure, you could bring another developer on board, but we can assume that whoever is building your app probably has a lot of knowledge that would need to be passed on so that you don't have to do a bunch of backtracking or stalling or rebuilding, which you obviously don't want to be doing. So what do you do in that situation? Well, the easy answer, and I'm a little bit biased here, but it's to build the app yourself. You could always build the app yourself. Now, don't worry, we're going to talk about what to do even if you don't want to build your app yourself. But remember, with no-code tools, you have a ton of power in your hands, and you could always set yourself up for long-term success by taking control of that power and building your own app. Now, like I said, we're going to answer this question regardless, because in reality, setting your app up to be handed off, whether someone is handing it off to another developer or another agency, or whether you are handing it off after building it yourself, regardless of which one of those things is happening, there are some things you can do right now, either yourself or again, with a developer or agency, to set yourself up for success in those scenarios, because ultimately one of them is going to happen. If you're building your app right now, then at some point, if you continue to grow, you're going to need to hand it off to someone else, or at least bring other people on board, because you as the founder can't be the developer forever if you want to keep growing. If someone else is building your app right now, it's safe to assume that person or those people won't be building your app forever. At some point, they'll need to move on, or you'll need to move on, and the same situation will happen. You'll need to pass the app along. So what can you do? Well, here's the deal. So we help our own entrepreneurs who work with us in our Build to Scale program. We help them go through a process of building their apps, but also creating documentation so that this very thing can happen. So right from the start, they're setting themselves up for success in these later stages. So in this scenario, what happens is the entrepreneur builds their app themselves, but they create certain pieces of documentation while they're doing that, assuming that as they grow, other developers, junior developers will need to come on board, and the app will need to mostly be handed off to them for maintenance and management moving forward. Okay, so that is assumed right from the start. And so I'm going to go through from a high level some of the documentation that they put together for that instance, because if you're building your app, obviously that's going to apply to you too. But if you're not building your app, if you're outsourcing, then these are things you're going to want your developer or your agency to put together documentation for, so they can share that documentation with you. Because if you have that, And not if, but when you need to move on at some point, bring another developer on or work with another agency, you can do so a lot more seamlessly and save yourself a lot of time, a lot of money, really just a lot of headache. So on the screen here, there are a couple of models, and both of these are going to represent or outline some of the documentation that you can start putting together, or that your agency or developer can start putting together. So the first thing I want to look at is this top one here on the screen, and there are 3 sections, and this accounts for 3 pieces of documentation within your app that you can start putting together. So up here we have in-app documentation, and down here in this section, which we'll get to, this is external documentation that you're going to want to put together, again, for yourself, or you're going to want for your agency or developer to put together for you. So when we're looking at in-app documentation, and specifically when you're using Bubble as your no-code platform. Now, I say specifically for Bubble because that's a platform that we like to use, and you can do these things within your Bubble editor to create this sort of documentation. So if you're using another no-code app development platform, then you'll have to translate these into things that will work for that platform, or you might have to take some of this in-app documentation and turn it into external documentation as well, again, just depending on the platform and the capabilities that it gives you. So the first thing that you want to do is make sure you label consistently. Okay. Now, when you're working in Bubble, all of your elements that you create, for example, you can label and name. And the bigger your app becomes, the more elements, the more pages, the more groups, the more things you're going to have within it. And if you don't have some sort of consistent labeling structure, then things are going to get cluttered, disorganized, and confusing really, really quickly. So a really quick example of this, right, of just labeling is with names of groups. Okay, let's say you have 10 different groups on a page. Well, if you name them consistently, then you can understand what those are for when you're looking through the page that also has 100 other elements on it. Or when you're working within your entire editor and you need to find something specifically, then you can have a consistent naming structure where you can search for exactly what you need and find exactly what you need. Now, by default, every single element you create is going to have its own name. But if you leave those names there and you don't change them, and again, create a consistent structure for yourself, then your app is going to really just simply become very cluttered. Now, when you're thinking about handing off your app or taking your app from one developer to another, cluttered means time. More time figuring out what the heck anything is, where anything is, what it does, right? And time equals money. So the more time someone has to spend digging through your app and figuring out what everything is and just finding things in order to be able to then change or add or iterate, right? The more time they spend doing that, the more money you're going to pay. Okay, so this is a really easy way to just go ahead and combat that right from the start. This is something that I would encourage you to do and encourage your developer or your agency to do if they aren't already. Now, the next thing that you want to look at is organizing and documenting. Okay, so within Bubble, again, you can set yourself up for more clarity within your editor in your development simply by organizing and documenting things. So a real quick example of this is with your workflows. You can color code your workflows so that you understand exactly where to go when you're doing testing or troubleshooting. If there are issues that come up in your app, you can more easily pinpoint and identify those, right? So just really, really simple stuff we're talking about here. I'm going to put that down here. The example is color coding. It's so simple and it's so easy, but it's also really easy to overlook, and it's not often done. If you don't do this, though, you're not going to have any reference points in the app. So we've experienced this before when we used to build apps for people, and they would come in sometimes with existing apps, maybe that other developers have built. So I'm speaking from that perspective. When they would come in with these apps that had 0 reference points, 0 organization, oftentimes, it was really just easier to rebuild the app from scratch in a much cleaner way. And that's why this is so important, because we've witnessed that, experienced that ourselves. We don't want you to have to go through that, because it's such a waste of time and money. After that, a really easy thing you can do is comment and annotate in your app. So again, within Bubble specifically, you can leave notes within your app's editor. And while you can leave notes about anything and everything, if you have consistent documentation and specific documentation within this, it can be really helpful when the app is handed off. So when you are building an app, there's no one single way to achieve really any certain outcome. Usually there are multiple ways to do something, but due to specific needs or use cases, different factors will push you in the direction of one solution versus another. Now, it can take time to figure out what those factors are and which solution is correct. So if you have, let's say, 5 ways to accomplish one thing, and you spend, or your developer spends potentially days, right, hours and hours of time narrowing it down to the single best path, and then moves forward with that path, well, you're going to want to know why that path was chosen versus the others, because when you go to build on top of that, or when another developer goes to build on top of that, or iterate that, if they don't have the context, well, they might just turn it back into, or maybe they would steer it in the direction of another path, right? And just not having the context of why that path was chosen in the first place. And it can create a lot of confusion and, again, lead to a lot of rebuilding because that context isn't there. And so an example of this is really just leaving why comments. Right? So why has one path been chosen over another? Even creating comments or annotation in your app for that can be really helpful, big picture, because if it's not there, then it can lead to improper expansion. Okay, expansion, iterating, updating, all of that. And you don't want that, because again, ultimately it all comes back to spending more time, which is more money, and really just delaying your launch potentially, or updates if users are on board, and you don't want to run into any of that. Okay, so we have labeling consistently. Again, that consistently is the key word here. We have organizing and documenting, and obviously that should be done with consistency as well. And we have commenting and annotating. These are all really, really simple things to do as development happens. So if you're building your app, go ahead and start doing these things. If someone else is building your app, make sure they're doing these things. Now, it can go well beyond this, and there are specific ways that are helpful to label, specific ways that are helpful to organize and document and annotate, and all of that. But hopefully these few examples can give you an idea of the direction you can take to start creating more clarity and consistency within your app for that inevitable handoff at some point. So that covers the in-app documentation. And now we want to look at the external documentation. So the reason why I'm adding this on here is specifically because we have what we'll call a playbook that we give to our own clients to create documentation as they go through their apps. Again, knowing that at a certain point as they grow, they're likely going to want to bring on other developers, junior developers. So with that in mind, remember that this still applies to you if you are outsourcing your app. And if your agency or developer can create something like this for you, it's going to be so much more helpful in the long run. So I'll walk you through from a high level how we do it so that you can hopefully get started, at least with a conversation about this. So one of the first things that you want to look at really is the scope of your app. Now I'm talking the full scope app, and you're going to have different versions, and you should be breaking down your scope rather into these different versions. So you have your pilot version or your version 1. You're going to have your first beta rollout, potentially other beta rollouts, expanded versions from there, initial versions of new features, and then iterations of those features as different versions, right? So you want to take your full scope and you want it documented. Now, keep in mind that your full scope app should never be set in stone. And that's because your full scope app should really be dictated by user feedback. But you do want to have that big picture view up front so that you can cut out, like slice and dice, really bring out that pilot version that should be focused on now, and then have a path at least for the next versions so that you can have more specific ways, or have more specific cues rather, for what feedback you need to get, what more you need to validate as you take users through your app. So if you have your pilot version and literally nothing else thought through in terms of features that would solve the problem that your app is solving, if you've thought nothing else through, then what's going to happen is you'll bring your initial users on board and you'll get a lot of feedback from them. But I guarantee you what will happen, because this always happens, is you're going to get tons of feedback that varies widely. And if you take that feedback and you try to start implementing all of it, then you're going to spread yourself way too thin. And you're probably going to have a hard time ever moving the app forward from there in a healthy way, in a strategic way. Instead, you want to have a full roadmap where you have already anticipated what the next version should look like, but don't set them in stone. Instead, slice and dice so that you can take out that pilot version, get user feedback, and see how it trends based on the rest of your roadmap. Okay, and it's going to help you gauge what questions you need to ask. It's going to help you gauge what features you need to validate. It's going to help you gauge how to prioritize feedback, really. Okay, so make sure that, all that's to say, make sure that your scope is documented, not just the initial scope, but the next version, so that you can better guide your development, your testing, and prioritization of feedback from there. Okay, now the next thing that I want to see you documenting or having documentation of is your database. So one of the things that we do with our own clients is we have them visually structure their database before putting that into their app by following a specific process that we've set up. Now, however you want to document this it's whatever works for you, just make sure it's documented. Okay, so if you are handing your app off to another developer, documentation like this is going to show them that foundational level, exactly why your data structure was set up in the way that it was. And when they go to iterate or expand on top of your app, change things in your app, it's going to be so much easier for them when they have that initial clarity of why things happened in the first place. These are those initial building blocks that are going to just help them take the app forward more seamlessly. And adding to that, looking at the architecture, probably spelled that wrong there, but we'll go with it. So if you look at the data structure, we'll look at the overall app architecture as well, the structure of the pages, the navigation, really the usability of the app. When you document that, and this is another thing that we like to visually document and document in written ways as well, just to add more depth to it. But when you document this, you start to really see the frame of the app, right? Imagine this as you building a house, right? You have the blueprint, which is the scope. You have the database, that's the foundation for the app. You have for the house, you have the architecture, right? The actual frame of the house. And when you have those things, imagine, adding a new room onto the house. Well, you're going to be able to know structurally where and how you can do that, the best ways you can do that, how that should be laid out. Right. So if you can kind of make that comparison, you can see how documentation like this can be so helpful. And then after that, one of the things that we like to do is document the alpha testing. Right now, we have a specific way that we document alpha testing when we do alpha testing with our own clients. But if you're doing alpha testing on your own, or if you have an agency who's helping you with alpha testing, either way, and you're probably doing it on your own, but either way, make sure that's documented as well, so that you can actually see what needs to be changed, but not only what needs to be changed in the immediate, but when you look back on the initial version that has been alpha tested, you can see the way the entire app has come together. So again, if we have our scope down here, we document our database, we document the overall app architecture. Really, the alpha testing is pulling all of that together, right? You're making sure that the app functions. Users can go from point A to point B successfully, okay? It's not a perfect app, it's just a functioning app. And when you document that, and especially when you document it, not just the alpha testing as it happens, but the alpha testing or the alpha version after the alpha testing has happened, when you document that, that's kind of like you're drawing a line in the sand, or you're setting a new baseline for yourself. Okay, pilot version complete. Now let's build the next level, or now let's lay the next layer, iterate, whatever it is. But this sort of documentation it brings it full circle and gives you a really strong foundation to move forward with. So this, it might look like there are a lot of different pieces here, but hopefully you can see that a lot of it is about consistency in app, right? When you're documenting in the app, make sure you're consistent. Make sure you are almost like creating your own language in terms of documenting the app, making sure that everything makes sense. So if when you are doing your external documentation, you're looking at the app from as a whole, right? And you're looking outside of the editor. If you're looking at in-app documentation, it's like, can you bring a developer from start to finish in your app without them getting lost? Externally, can you bring a user through your app from start to finish without them getting lost? Okay, so I encourage you to make sure you are creating this type of documentation correctly if you are building your app, because at some point, you're going to want to bring on another developer if you continue to grow. And if someone else is building your app, make sure they are creating this type of documentation for you, because at some point you will have to move on to them, or at some point, maybe you'll want to try to take over the app yourself. And then later on, maybe bring in other developers. There are different ways you can take this, many ways you can build your app, but one thing remains true regardless. You need to make sure your app is organized and clear if you want to save time, save money, and save a lot of headache down the road when these types of situations happen as you grow. All right. So with all of that, if you're moving forward with your app and you want to be putting the correct pieces in place like this, you want to be building your app strategically. You want to be following the appropriate steps in the correct order, doing the right things at the right times. We have a free workshop over at coachingnocodeapps.com/ workshop you can join in on. It'll take you through this section of the documentation actually, so that you can go ahead and get a head start on that. But if you want to join in on that, head to coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop. We'd love to have you there. All right. I hope this was helpful. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.